Hello, good afternoon. We're going to come in today and read Moosetache. Moose had a problem. A horrible, hairy, prickly problem. It grew right below his nostrils and just above his upper lip. A moosetache. Now, not a few spare hairs or shy little stubble. No mere weak wandering whiskers on the upper lip of this moose. No siree. But a moosetache? That was a burly, surly, mangly mess, and it itched a lot. Sure, he plucked, and he tweezed, he even clipped, snipped, and teased. But his combs were still cowards, and his brushes rebelled. His scissors simply surrendered. Moose was in a frizzy tizzy. The moosetache was completely crimping his style. He was a great hoofer, but he could barely bop and hip-hop with a moosetache going flip-flop. He was a wonderful chef, but he simply could not flambe his souffle with all those whiskers in his way. And he was a daring skier, but how could he downhill ski with the mighty moosetache blowing in his face? Moose had to do something, and fast. But what? After days and days of much serious thought, Moose got an idea. He crossed his hair here, he crossed his hair there, and he tied his moosetache around his neck. A moose scarf seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect. But then his moosetache got knotted and mangled and horribly tangled. And those hundreds of hairs still prickled and tickled. Worse, Moose could barely take a breath with all that moosetache wrapped around his neck. So Moose untied, unwrapped, unknotted, and gulped in some fresh air. He got another idea. He parted some hair here, he parted some hair there, and heaped all of his moosetache on top of his head. Moustachioed antlers seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect, until a squadron of squirrels and one very nosy gopher moved right in to the Moose Motel. They huddled and hoarded, furrowed and burrowed. Needless to say, it became quite crowded up there on Moose's head, and heavy, and messy, and very, very noisy. The squirrely chitting and chatting, squeals and squawks woke Moose up every morning before the crack of dawn, and that gopher was giving the moose one hairy headache. Moose needed his sleep. He needed his rest. He needed his privacy. Moustachioed antlers? Nuts, said Moose. So he unparted and unpiled, untwisted and untwined, and said adios to those hairy horns. But now what? What? The miserable moose took hold of his hunk of hair, and he wrestled it, then roped it, then tethered it, tied and tamed. Aha! A moose tail! Now that was so simple. That was so easy. That was not so perfectly perfect. Talk about a dizzy do! Moose didn't know if he was coming or going. Backward, forward, that way, this way. He didn't know which end was which. Moose had a bail on the tail. And so he thought, and thought, and thought some more. But no other idea was a worthy winner. Braids were a bother, a moustache sweater, too sweltering. Poor Moose. His problem was truly terrible, unbearable, just downright sad. He felt so alone. He didn't know what else to do. Then call it fate. Call it destiny. It was probably just me being lucky. But one day, Moose tripped into his moustache and just had no time to duck. "Oh, pardon me, pardon me," they both said as they bumped. Then they blinked. Then they stared. And their hearts went thump-a-thump. She was a moose with a buffet so bodacious, outrageous, well, it was just plain old big. Hair after hair piled higher than high, a skyscraper due of glorious curls, a tower of swirling twists and twirls. So she was simply splendid, stupendous, absolutely superb. Of course, Moose had to ask how she did what she did to get such a do. Miss Moose winked and then whispered, "Just a little glue." So she helped he fearlessly plunge a hoof onto a fat pot of the white goopy goop, and carefully, oh so carefully, they glopped, and they plopped, they pasted, they pressed, they coaxed and curled every truly unruly, wayward whisker. Around and around they tweaked and twirled those horrible hairs until Moose's once mangly mess was now a wondrous winding wave of marvelous moustache. Moose gazed into the mirror and smiled a broad, mosey smile. He was so happy, so glad, just giddy with glee. He looked dashing and handsome. Moose gushed, "Is this really me?" With not a care for one hair, the moose pair boogied and bopped. They skied uphill, they skied downhill, and their cooking was hot, hot, hot. So of course it wasn't long after that Moose and his moustache and his beautiful bride fox-trotted and tangoed and waltzed down the aisle. Good hair days, bad hair days. They vowed to love and to cherish, and with their hearts heaped with love and pots filled with goop, they both sighed, "I do glue," and promised never to part. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect, and it stuck. Have a great evening.